Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the first ever virtual environmental studies senior capstone presentation. We've never done this before. This is innovative on top of innovative. So thanks everyone for showing up. It's great to see some of your virtual faces and see that you guys are doing well. Thanks to members of the community who've been able to show up as well. This is always an exciting time of year. I'll just say some very brief introductory notes and then kind of turn it over to the first of our two capstone groups this evening. So the Environmental Studies Senior Capstone seminars are really an exciting culmination to the undergraduate environmental studies experience. They are unique in a number of ways. They're not just kind of the culmination of all the different things that you've learned over the years. It's also an attempt to kind of bring everything together, to be integrative, to be interdisciplinary, to kind of see what happens when the rubber hits the road. And so all the projects are integrative, they are applied, and they are outcomes driven. These are projects with a culminating presentation, experience, proposal, project at the end of them. And so they're really different than other classes and, you know, in some ways more challenging, in some ways more rewarding, right? They're a complicated mix of this. As such, we also have a unique set of instructors who help us with these classes. We have exceptional environmental professionals who are kind of working on the ground environmental problems and solutions. And this semester, the two capstones were guided by Clarissa Diaz and Derek Sylvan. And so I want to thank them both for guiding both capstone projects as well as capably improvising a unprecedented and relatively complex transition to remote learning. So thank you both for that. I also want to thank our students for weathering an unprecedented and exceptionally challenging situation with this transition. And I know you guys kept on persisting and pulling everything together, and I'm really looking forward to the fruits of those efforts. To a couple of really quick notes. You can write your questions in the chat box. Remember to kind of mute yourself during the presentations to make sure there's no accidental disruption. Write the question in the chat box and the group will reply to those questions at the end of their presentations. And I'll also kind of put in the chat box a Google form link that you can fill out for each of the capstone presentations with feedback that we share with the groups so that they have you know, some feedback about, you know, what worked, what didn't, any open questions they might have. And so I'll share that via the chat function and you can please reply to that. We have two capstone presentations this evening, the first on clean energy and innovation, and the second is on parks over plastic. And I'm really gonna just have them take the lead. We'll have the first, we'll have Q&A, we'll transition to the parks over plastic, we'll have Q&A and kind of wrap things up there. If you have any questions for me, you can kind of privately chat me throughout this entire time. And without further ado, I would like to hand it off to the clean energy group.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction. We are, again, the Clean Energy and Innovation cohort of the capstone class. We've been looking at conditions necessary for energy transitions, as well as the development of clean technologies with Professor Sylvan for the past semester. So the key goals of the course have been trying to understand in more complexity the government's role in technology development. So thinking about what role are they currently playing, to what extent might that need to shift in coming years. We've also been analyzing and evaluating policies that target climate and energy goals. And all of this has been working toward the culminating project that we'd like to share with you today, which are specific policy recommendations on how policymakers can help advance these targets. So to really get a clear sense of exactly what we were working with, we focused on first understanding the climate and energy landscape federally and in New York State. We've looked at incentive programs such as technology push and demand pull tools. We've thought about what sort of considerations might make policies effective, such as job production, economic spillovers in other sectors, and also thinking about what sort of considerations of equity and justice might be at the center of these policies. And also we've taken into consideration the extent to which international competition and cooperation might be able to play a role in clean energy transitions. So as part of the class, we've all completed individual projects as well as the projects that we are presenting today. So we've all completed a case study and a stakeholder interview. Some examples of case studies include the California climate investments, which allocate funds from California's cap and trade scheme to communities that face disproportionate amounts of pollution. Another example is looking at Germany's Renewable Energy Sources Act, which is a market premium scheme that features a feed-in tariff and a feed-in priority. We've also all completed stakeholder interviews, as I said. One example has been speaking with somebody who was able to start a small-scale solar farm in northern New Jersey, and another person was able to speak to a facilities engineer at an oil corporation in Texas. So I think that provides insight into the ways in which fossil fuel companies might need to play a role in the clean energy transition. And again, what we'd like to share with you all today are specific policy recommendations that we've developed throughout the semester. We're divided into two separate groups, so half of us have focused on New York State, and half of us have focused on the federal landscape. The New York State group has decided to focus on building electrification, whereas the federal group is looking at carbon reduction mechanisms. So for the past semester, I've had the opportunity to work alongside my colleagues to develop policy for New York State, which we'll talk about now. The building electrification through heat pump technology has been the focus of our study, and building electrification refers broadly to the process of replacing fossil fuel-based heating systems with electrified ones. So the driving question behind our research this semester has really been, how can we meet the deep decarbonization goals that are set forth in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? The CLCPA is a New York statewide policy that calls for 40% reductions from 1990 emissions by 2030 and net zero carbon emissions economy-wide by the year 2050. We believe that heat pumps are a real opportunity in meeting these goals, as emissions from residential, commercial, and industrial buildings constitute 56% of fuel combustion emissions in New York State, and heat pumps can really be effective in facilitating the switch to more renewable grids. Currently, heat pumps have the potential to save up to 50% in heating emissions, and they're already cost competitive in many markets. New Efficiency New York is an example of a policy that's already in place that aims to provide more heat pump use throughout New York State. They project a savings target of 3.6 trillion British thermal units, and we are kind of building upon this existing policy in the following recommendations that we provide. So we have two specific policy recommendations and one research recommendation that we'd like to share with you today. The policy recommendation includes improved performance standards as well as a distinct technology push initiative. And in terms of future research, we've identified variable refrigerant flows, also known as VRF technology, as being exceedingly helpful in being able to switch buildings over to more renewable technologies in instances where heat pump technology might not make sense yet. And we'll talk about that in more depth in the coming slides.
Thanks, Claire. So next I'll share how the technology of heat pumps actually work, why it creates energy savings, and also some of the limitations that they face, which will be addressed through some of our recommendations. So instead of burning fossil fuels on site to heat up buildings, heat pumps use electricity to transfer heat into the building. So currently there are three types of heat pumps, which are air-to-air, water source, and also geothermal heat pumps. So next slide, please. Yeah. So the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation estimates that we can save up to 31 trillion British thermal units of energy just from installing heat pumps in New York State by 2025. By increasing the amount of electricity that we use, this building electrification technology allows us to integrate more clean energy sources into our energy portfolio instead of burning fossil fuels on site. It also increases the load responsive flexibility. So what this means is that it allows us to direct energy use during grid peak periods to off-peak usage. So, however, we also have to take note of the fact that it is inefficient in extreme hot and cold weather, which means that it is also inefficient in taller buildings because there's increasing wind speeds and also lower temperatures at higher altitudes.
So our first suggestion is improving performance standards. We believe that New York State should enact a target of 30 TBTUs of energy savings from the adoption of heat pumps within the next 5 years. This is about 17% of the state's total energy efficiency goal and would efficiently power 306,000 homes. By adopting this lofty goal, that New York is serious and committed to electrifying buildings as a way to accomplish the current carbon goals under the CLCPA. At the same time, it is feasible based on the VEIC's energy savings estimate. Over the next 5 years, New York is already investing over $6.8 billion in energy efficiency and clean heat investments. $1.2 billion of that is coming from NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and $1.5 billion of that is coming from the New York Power Authority, NYPA. We believe that $1.156 billion, or 17% of the fund, should be redirected towards heat pumps, as these recommendations will aid NYSERDA in their efforts to switch customers over to heat pumps. Another aggressive goal would be to put heat pumps in 67% of households by 2030. This would only be, obviously, if we are able to meet the first goal. And this would result in a decrease in carbon emissions of 20% in the residential sector and 3.5% in total from the 1990 baseline coming from heat pumps alone, which is pretty impressive. Adjustments and progress should be overseen by NYSERDA, as they already receive much of the information in the form of HVAC market reports, and utilities should help if needed. NYSERDA should emphasize their efforts on vulnerable and poor communities by expanding their clean heating and cooling community program, which currently provides incentives for heat pump installations to low and middle income families. On top of that, utility services should also provide greater incentives for heat pumps, as the current incentives are minimal, somewhere between $100 and $250. If all of these targets, which should be clear and concise, if all of them are met, this should drastically lower the carbon emissions emitted via heating and cooling systems across the state of New York.
Our second suggestion is a technology push strategy. So it is necessary to advance research in cold climate air source heat pumps, which are a newer technology than traditional air source heat pumps, and are designed to be more efficient for heating homes in colder regions. There is skepticism of whether or not cold climate heat pumps are able to maintain reliability and resiliency in harsher weather, for example, in upstate New York. So a larger portion of the funds from NYSERDA and the NYPA must be devoted to improve heat pump technology and encourage tech push programs. Additionally, we suggest to start a heat pump development grant in order to inspire development and stimulate technological innovation for cold climate heat pumps. This competition will be funded by NYSERDA. Additionally, finalists from the competition will be able to partner with NYU Tandon School of Engineering's Urban Future Lab to even further develop their ideas. Lastly, high-rise buildings are a necessary target because electricity use per square meter of floor area in high-rise buildings is nearly 2.5 times greater than in low-rise buildings, and there are currently over 7,000 high-rise buildings in New York City. Efficiency and resiliency is harder to manage in these taller buildings because, as Chu said, that the higher up you go in these tall buildings, there is a decrease in temperature, and there is a need to be more development in technology in order for electrification to remain cost effective.
So, with ongoing climate initiatives such as the CLCPA, New York has much to accomplish. When it comes to addressing building electrification, the state has mainly focused on research and incentives to advance heat pump technology. However, this technology still falls short of covering energy efficiency for all building types. We therefore offer one consideration for New York State in an effort to work towards meeting climate targets through improving building efficiency. Variable refrigerant flow systems are multi-split units. The key component of this system is the use of refrigerant in either a subcooled liquid or a subheated vapor state to simultaneously heat and cool spaces. Not new to HVAC technology, VRFs have the potential to bridge the gap heat pumps leave in building electrification in two particular ways. By number one, being able to effectively function within high-rise buildings, and number two, effectively functioning in colder climate regions. But despite the various advantages of VRFs, many questions remain, notably the potential refrigerant leakage may cause, as well as the unidentified and verified long-term energy savings of VRF systems. Particularly in New York, there's a lack of practical field data on VRF installations, which ultimately continues to weigh on broader promotion of this type of technology. Therefore, in order for New York State to effectively meet its targets for energy efficiency, We recommend for NYSERDA to consider conducting a cost-benefit analysis to evaluate potential savings and effectiveness of VRF installations within high-rise buildings, multifamily buildings, as well as older infrastructure and historical landmarks throughout the state. Such an assessment will cover current factors like initial costs, current technology and material available, as well as long-term energy savings and applicability, all in an effort to determine the practicality for New York to invest in this type of technology. Ultimately, a cost-benefit analysis will serve as a starting point for the likely introduction of future VRF incentives as well as related policies if this type of technology is proven sufficiently beneficial to the state and its climate initiatives.
So to reiterate, our policy recommendations involved improved performance standards and also technology push, which we believe can be truly effective at promoting electrification through the installation of heat pumps and also turn away from fossil fuel-based heating. At the same time, we also believe that VRFs have the potential to fill key gaps in the heat pump technology, and we believe that the cost-benefit analysis will help us find out if that is possible. Ultimately, we believe that heat pumps present a feasible pathway forward to meet the ambitious goal of the CLCPA and can set precedents for other states to follow suit.
For our federal policy proposal, we chose to focus on demand pull strategies in order to increase deployment of clean energy technologies. Clean energy technologies have already proven to be cost competitive, and while we do recognize that R&D has a critical role in developing new technologies within the clean energy industry, the United States is capable of cutting fossil fuel emissions today and will need to do so if aggressive climate goals are to be met. And so it is our recommendation to implement 3 demand pull policies in order to ramp up deployment. And these would be a federal renewable portfolio standard, a carbon fee and associated dividend funds, and the establishment of a federal siting committee. All 3 will work collectively towards increasing renewable energy deployment. We believe that under these guidelines, if implemented no later than January of 2022, we should expect to see 60% of energy portfolios filled by renewables per state by 2050.
So the first policy we're suggesting is that of a federally imposed RPS, which stands for Renewable Portfolio Standard. These are basically enforced regulations that help push growth for renewable energy sources. While there are currently 30 states within the US, as well as US territories that have some sort of RPS plan in place, there's no federally imposed RPS. And because of that, there's been an uneven distribution of participations across the United States in terms of the country's overall shift towards renewable energy. The RPS we are proposing will mandate that any entity that supplies electric utilities, including municipal, cooperative, and investor-owned, must procure a minimum quantity of electricity products from eligible renewable energy resources so that the total kilowatt hours of those products sold to their retail end-use customers achieve 4% by January 1st of 2022 and increasing by 2% each fiscal year thereafter. Under these proposed regulations, all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and all U.S. territories will have an energy portfolio composed of 60% renewables by the year 2050. We've identified 3 components of this RPS in order to make sure that the policy is successful. The first being non-compliance penalties will be established to provide states with an incentive to follow the RPS and make sure they plan to achieve all of their goals on time. The second being the cost of complying with the mandated standards should be fairly distributed across all utility customers. And the third will be that the RPS will apply to all sectors, not just investor-owned utilities. So with this federally mandated RPS, we hope to give states the freedom to create their own framework and decide how they should apply their own in-state penalties to ensure they are in compliance with the standard each year.
So in addition to the federal RPS, the second policy we're recommending is a carbon fee and dividend. Combined with the federal RPS, we believe this will guarantee a clean energy sector transition by encouraging the progress of renewable energy in states with pre-existing energy goals. And it will also prevent corporations from transferring their carbon-based energy production to other states. The carbon fee will be a $15 per ton fee on the production of fossil fuels,
which will include coal, oil, and gas. A journal by a professor of economics at Tufts University reported that a tax of $15 per metric ton of carbon dioxide nearly doubles the price of coal, making it more expensive than the clean energy alternatives. In addition to the carbon fee, we recommend two funds: the Carbon Dividend Fund, which distributes money collected from the carbon fee to US citizens and residents, and the second is the Climate Equity Fund. And this fund will provide grants for projects in marginalized and coal-dependent communities. And the goal of this fund is to alleviate any financial pressures in cities and towns across the US that shoulder the biggest burden with the carbon fee. We therefore recommend the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which was introduced to the House in 2019. This proposed bill includes a $15 per ton fee with an increasing $10 per ton annual rate. The carbon fee also includes repayments for fossil fuel companies that properly capture and sequester their carbon emissions. And it also places a special fee on fluorinated gases, which are the most potent in the atmosphere. However, we would amend the act by introducing the second Climate Equity Fund, which was mentioned previously. Not only does this increase the likelihood of the bill actually being passed, but it also provides the extra support to the cities most vulnerable to these energy changes. Overall, a carbon fee and dividend will cut greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 1 billion metric tons within a decade, according to the US Energy Information Administration. It'll also encourage the deployment and investment of clean energy, and it'll minimize any economic disruptions by redistributing the carbon funds to alleviate the stress of those most impacted by an energy transition.
Our next policy has to do with siting, permitting, and transmission. So the siting and permitting process for wind and solar projects, or the process of receiving approval for project development, is really long and uncertain, which creates a barrier to deploying clean energy technologies. And another barrier that stands in the way is the lack of high capacity transmission infrastructure. Our policy is based on New York's recently passed Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which is going to establish an Office of Renewable Siting, creating uniform standards and streamlining the siting process. It's also going to provide support for the planning, investment, and development of transmission infrastructure. And this is what provides the basis for our policy recommendation. So we recommend establishing a federal siting committee that produces guidelines for states to enforce more uniform and consistent siting regulations, as states currently have varied siting processes. We want to emphasize that these are just guidelines and recommendations for states, as they won't be forced to comply. So currently, projects that are proposed on private land must be approved by state and local agencies. Under our policy, the siting process would continue at the state level, but would be guided by the federal committee. So for example, some states such as Arizona, Arkansas, and California have wind siting processes that are conducted by local governments rather than at the state level. And in California and New York, projects are subject to environmental review, where other states might not require that. So by creating clear uniform standards across regions, that'll streamline the development of renewable energy projects by making the process less convoluted and uncertain. So for example, the Federal Siting Committee could suggest that all applications must be acted upon within a certain time period. And there also must be different regional guidelines in order to account for different conditions in various regions. And again, we want to emphasize that these would just be guidelines and models of policies for the state to follow. The federal government can't force states to adopt these, so that would be a weak point of this policy. However, our other policies like carbon fee and RPS incentivize adoption of clean energy, so states will have a higher incentive to deploy renewable energy quickly, and hopefully they'll follow the federal guidelines to help reach goals. And in terms of projects on federal lands, there must be a streamlined siting and environmental review process. So currently, after developers submit right-of-way applications for projects on federal lands, the processing can often be delayed due to the Bureau of Land Management specialists consulting with other agencies. And the Federal Siting Committee will also be charged with coordinating handoffs between agencies more efficiently.
So the National Environmental Protection Act requires that all projects on federal lands conduct an environmental impact statement, which currently takes an average of 3.5 years and costs up to millions of dollars to produce. So we are proposing that some of the revenue generated by projects will be put towards fast tracking environmental impact statements, as they currently cost millions of dollars to produce. Another issue that needs to be addressed is development of transmission infrastructure. So transmission lines are critical since they connect power generation facilities to distribution systems that make the final delivery of electricity to commercial and residential customers. So basically, transmission lines just get energy from where it's generated to where it needs to go to keep the lights on. The development of transmission infrastructure is expensive, and it does have an upfront cost, but it pays for itself over time through the economic and reliability benefits that are provided. And some of these benefits include things like helping consumers access lower cost electricity, reducing the need to build additional electricity generation to hold in reserve, and also providing economic development and jobs. So the entity that operates the grid in parts of the Midwest, known as MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, has calculated that benefits of new transmission are 2.6 to 3.9 times greater than their cost, and they will provide $13 billion to $50 billion in net benefits over the next 20 to 40 years. So this comes out to be about $275 to $1,000 per person that's served by that grid. The lack of high capacity transmission has continuously limited the deployment of solar technology because there hasn't been enough focus on interstate transmission lines. So the current focus needs to be shifted from intrastate transmission lines to interstate transmission lines. And this would lead to the prioritization of lines that could deliver energy from solar generation facilities to demand centers, also known as load centers. We know that this kind of planning requires a lot of coordination, which is why it would be overseen by the Federal Siting Committee, and they'll have to work closely with those on the regional level to assist with the planning, permitting, cost allocation, and the construction of key foundational lines, and also making sure that the projects are completed within the indicated timeframe.
So federal policy presents a unique challenge in that it applies uniformly to all states, yet no two states are identical in their potential renewable production nor in their consumption. So it is our hope through our policy proposal that we've addressed the balancing uniformity with state autonomy, allowing lagging states to catch up without severe economic damage or resentment, and helping to create more opportunities and potential for implementation. Hopefully by combining these three aspects, we hope to establish and nurture a cooperative and cohesive relationship between federal and state governments in order to bolster the implementation of new green technologies and green energy production.
So overall, our research, interviews, and case studies have led us to come up with mostly demand pull policies to advance the deployment of clean energy. We found that many clean energy technologies like wind and solar are ready for deployment and are already cost competitive. We can't afford to keep waiting for new and better technologies. We should be deploying the tech we have now if we want to attempt to reach our aggressive climate targets. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't keep improving our current technologies. So like with the heat pump example, there's still a lot of room for technological improvement, while at the same time, there's a need to utilize the heat pump technology we do have in places where it makes sense to use them. So this is why we suggest demand pull policies while also including a tech push policy, so that we can continue the advance of technologies while furthering deployment at the same time. And these policies will help us reach climate goals by lifting barriers blocking deployment, incentivizing clean energy, and creating larger markets for clean energy technologies, which in turn will trigger more innovation. Thank you for listening, and this concludes the Clean Energy and Innovation presentation.
Great, thank you so much. If anyone has questions and you want to put them into the chat, or we can also probably take some other ways if people have trouble with the chat. So I'm happy to sort of read out questions as they come in. People can also use the, is that good?
I have a question while others are potentially typing theirs. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm one of the environmental studies faculty members. I'm new for those of you who haven't met me yet. This question is for the federal group, specifically concerning the RFP and the carbon fee. The RFP had a 60% renewable proportion, and the carbon fee that you settled on was $15. I was curious how you came up with these numbers, especially considering that, you know, the IPCC special issue on 1.5 degrees Celsius said things like that we need to move towards carbon neutrality or near 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. Were those based off of things like political pragmatism? And if so, why not go for less of a renewable energy proportion than that? And regarding the carbon fee part, I might kick that over to Gernot, who has said, you know, on multiple occasions that a $40 a ton fee is woefully inadequate for displacement. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on that. And specifically, I know that you cited displacing coal as a motivation for that price, but what about other fossil fuel sources like natural gas? So 2 questions there, but mainly concerned about the first one, if other folks have questions in time.
Right. So I think the point of political pragmatism was pretty on point. You know, we were looking at states such as like California and what else? There states that were kind of leading the way in terms of their own RPS goals. And when you have states like Kentucky, which is only producing 2.3% renewable, it seemed pretty not unfair, but to set a really high initial percentage, if we were pushing for 100% renewable, they would be so heavily penalized as a community that we kind of wanted to, you know, start really low and build slow, and then still incentivize the states that already had high percentages via the carbon fee. So I don't want to say it was like an arbitrary number necessarily, but we thought that it was a fair number if certain states were only at around like 3 to 4% of renewable consumption within their state, that would give them, you know, time to transition to the policy. And then in terms of the carbon fee, I didn't look into the cost of other carbon-based sources, but in terms of coal, it was just simply the cost that would require coal to have a negative evaluation. So if coal was, if you had to pay someone $2.90 to take your coal off your hands, that's what it would equate to if it was $15 per ton of CO2. So we definitely could look into like oil and other carbon sources, but that's where the $15 came from. And it was also mentioned in the policy that we were kind of reflecting on as well, that's currently in front of Congress.
And just to add on a little bit to what Liam was saying, we found in research through a lot of journals, a lot of people were talking about the benefits of starting small with a carbon fee and then gradually adding on to that as the public gains more confidence. So that was the reason why we started with 15 instead of something like 25 or 40 as well. And I think also just too, the likelihood that it would get passed would be greater if it was not quite at 40, which we would like ideally, but.
So part of it is starting low and ramping that. Part of your strategy, or your political strategy, even if it's not part of this policy, is starting low and ramping up over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you, both of you, for that answer, and fantastic presentation to all of you.
If anyone else has questions, feel free to either add them in the chat or you can raise a hand or speak up. And I think we have another 3 or 4 minutes for questions if we have some.
I'll ask one.
Great.
Sorry. This is for the heat pumps. I'm curious as to whether or not you think that this could be something that homeowners could transition to as their sole source of heating and cooling, or would it have to be integrated into other systems, and what systems could that work with?
I can start this off. Thank you for your question. So I think the goal is generally to have a full transition to heat pump systems in place of existing or fossil fuel burning ones. As we had mentioned, in a lot of homes, it's already feasible, and it's in places that it's not quite cost competitive yet. I think the funds that we have allocated to promoting more widespread use will help to subsidize those large upfront costs. In terms of the technology, though, it does exist, and it is possible that it can completely replace the existing heating and cooling systems.
So I was thinking about the temperature thresholds, because it looked like if it gets below 30 degrees, they're really not efficient anymore. And in some studies, 40. So most of the state in the January temperatures would be colder than that. Or is that...
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the key concerns that we've had. Again, it has the potential to replace other heating and cooling systems in specific regions, as you said. Our hope is also that VRFs, and I think Dominique might be able to speak a little bit more about how VRFs can be more feasible in those situations, but eventually, and through our technology push initiative, we're hoping to be able to help spur more development and make them more effective in those colder temperatures. That would really help facilitate a total shift, even in the colder climates, as you're getting farther north in New York State.
Yeah, so based on the research that we've done, it does show the potential for VRFs to cover the issues in terms of the heating systems being applicable in colder regions. However, in terms of practicality in New York, the New York State itself, no research has been done on that, hence the reason why we recommended the cost-benefit analysis, which will incorporate like research in terms of current material and whatever technology is available right now. We recommend the cost-benefit analysis to evaluate how VRFs would be able to work to cover some of the issues, including the problems with colder climate regions, as well as the high-rise buildings and even like historical landmarks in New York, which we know we have a lot in New York City.
Thank you.
Great. We might have time for one more quick one if someone has it, or I think we're at 5:40. We're planning to switch over. Great. Well, thank you for the questions, and thank you to the group, and I'm excited to hear from the other capstone.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.